There are many benchmarks and predictions about the future of the world's churches. We're going to look inside one of these reports to see what churches are reporting about themselves. Is your church thriving or merely surviving? According to this survey, we're going to look at only 2% of churches were experiencing momentous growth, 56% were trying to simply maintain, while 14% said they were on life support. Tune in to see the data and find out how your church measures against these national indicators. Hey, let me hurry up and get into place. Hey, everybody, this is Dr. Michelle, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Tab Talks. I thought I'd use my avatar today to talk about the research that I just recently received called the Unstuck Church Report, and I found it was very informative. I found it informative because many churches post-COVID have been trying to figure out where they are in relationship to other churches. Are we doing good? Are we growing? Are we dying? What's happening? And so I think looking at this data in comparison to any church, you can look at your church or friend's church to see how people are really doing in this post-COVID time where people are trying to restructure and just trying to really figure out what the new normal is. So I hope you enjoy the research, and please feel free to leave comments and questions. Now, let's look at our key findings. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of what the Unstuck Church Report actually is. It consists of survey results from about 100 U.S. churches and international churches about their operations and their practices. And the data was collected using an online assessment tool called the Vital Signs Assessment Tool. And the data that we're going to be talking about today was collected between May 2021 and April 2022. I think it's important for us to get a sense of who actually participated and to get some background on the actual sample size. So there were a total of 119 churches that participated in this survey, and their audience sizes ranged from under 100 members to greater than 4,500 members. The average church was about 63 years in existence, and a third of the participating churches were non-denominational. I think one important metric that everybody wants to ask about is what was the average weekly attendance in the churches that were surveyed. Well, last year, they said their average weekly attendance was 691 members, and this year they were reporting 498. So that was a reduction of 28% in church attendance. But that doesn't tell the entire story, because even though you saw an overall reduction of 28% in membership, you actually saw a 22% increase in the number of new people that were coming into the church. So while you saw that almost 30% drop, you did start to see some new faces actually replacing some of those old faces that you weren't seeing. Initially, I think a lot of churches were excited that you saw a huge increase in your online viewership. But now that most of the churches have opened up, you're actually starting to see a decline in church attendance by your online membership. So they're not offsetting that 28% that you lost. Now, this isn't an indictment on your online audience. It's just telling you that the 28% that churches lost overall, they didn't see that 28% pop back up in their online audiences. Now, I found this to be a very interesting metric that when you look at children's church, and everybody is talking about children ministries, overall, you see the churches reporting that from the ages of their newborns to fifth grade, they had a decline of 27% in their children's ministry. And that's pretty significant. That's almost the equivalent of what you lost in terms of your adult population. Now, what is interesting when you're looking at young people actually coming to church, churches have been successful recruiting children from the 6th grade through the 12th grade. They seem to be more receptive to returning to an in-person church situation. And I'm sure it's because of socialization at this age group where people want to get out. They're not necessarily old enough, many of them, to go out on their own, but they can meet friends and come to church and socialize. So there's definitely an opportunity recruiting members within this age group. I don't think we should be surprised by this metric that last year churches were averaging like 668 online viewers, and they actually experienced a decrease of about 15% in their online viewership. But you have to remember, during COVID, many churches were closed and they were advising people not to come into large groups or socialize. And so the only option, the viable option for many individuals was to watch church online. Now that you see that churches are opening back up because of vaccines and mask mandates, people are starting to see that they did see a decrease in their online viewership. What we are beginning to see in this data is that 68% of the respondents offered multiple weekend services. So we're starting to see the church opening up scheduling and opportunities for families to connect with the church simply because people have such busy lives. The church is trying to accommodate their members by offering services at multiple times over the weekend. Now, if you remember in the beginning of the research, we said that some of these churches that participated in this survey had more than 4,500 members. So you've got a wide range of size church, and so 20% of the churches are multi-site. This wasn't just very large churches. So I think what you're starting to see is that as people want to be able to engage within their communities and not necessarily travel far outside of their communities, the churches are reaching out to them by having multiple locations. So you may see a church have a suburban location and an urban location because they're trying to go and meet people where they are. Now, this information was very interesting in that when you looked at the actual worship style that's happening in churches, that responded, 69%, almost 70% said they're doing a contemporary style worship service. 17% were doing a variety of worship services. It was kind of like a have it your way type style. And then 12% were still doing traditional worship services. But what was most interesting about this was that the churches that were in the group doing the variety of worship services seemed to be the ones that were struggling. They did not have a true sense of identity or what their brand was. So they were doing a little bit of anything, I think, out of desperation to try to get membership. So I think this is very interesting research that if you're going to develop whatever your style is or whatever your brand, it may be confusing to people if they really don't know what your brand is because you're trying to do a little bit of everything just to survive. This was an interesting metric as well when you looked at baptisms per 100 attendees. Last year, for every 100 members, they had about 3 people that were baptized. This year, you've seen an increase, about 5 people for every 100. So just to kind of put this in perspective, if your church has, say, 200 people, what we're seeing is in a year, if your church has 200 people, you should baptize 10 people. So I think that's a very interesting metric. So if people are trying to figure out, we didn't have 25 people get baptized last year, well, people aren't seeing those numbers. So every 100 attendees is how you're going to measure that. And, if you're in the 5, like for every 100, you got 5 people that were baptized, you're right in the benchmark with the sample size. Now, what I did find interesting about this statistic was that 24% of churches have discontinued requiring membership or a partnership type commitment to connect to the church. So what you're seeing is that people are out, they're evangelizing, they're inviting people to come to their churches, but they are not making it a requirement to join, to fellowship. And I think probably that approach is subtle, that as people become more engaged and they become more active in the church and they're worshiping, there's not this heavy push for membership. And I found that very, very fascinating. I think when I looked at this statistic, I thought, wow, that's probably your young families that are really just getting started. You know, they may have relocated. They may think they're only going to be in the city temporarily. So they want to connect with a church, but not necessarily even leave their home church where they came from because of work and jobs. I think what this statistic is telling us that as you saw more people being added to the church database, basically a 22% increase, people recognized that they needed to give their demographic information to the church so they could stay connected. So your ability to be able to call you had to have the right phone numbers, the right addresses just to be connected. And so people did see an increase in the church database being used. I don't know about everybody else, but I did find this interesting that you're seeing a growing trend. 83% of the respondents offer home groups as an option to connect with others, and just 7% only offer Sunday school as an option. So what you're seeing is churches trying to develop these smaller cohort groups to connect, worship, fellowship, and they may be their own distinct small Sunday school class, and they're not actually coming into a physical church to have that class. They could be meeting in each other's homes, Zoom. Very, very interesting trend. And I found this interesting video clip about church being held in houses, and I just had to share this with you.
All right, I want to take a few minutes here to answer two foolish arguments I've heard supposedly in favor of church buildings. These guys get desperate. They'll come out with all kinds of stuff. And the first one goes like this. In Acts chapter 2, verse 41, it says, "Then they that gladly received his word were baptized, and the same day there were added unto them about 3,000 souls." And they say, well, see, if house churches are the way that was done in the New Testament, did they have a house that was big enough to hold 3,000 souls? Huh? I don't think that they were meeting in the living room. And they go, yeah. Okay. Then let's continue with your logic there, your line of reasoning. They had 3,000 people get saved. They couldn't all meet in a house. Okay. Where did they meet? See, they want to make this little thing. They'll say this little thing, the church building idolaters, and they'll say 3,000 people got saved, couldn't meet in a house, so it's okay that we have church buildings. Kind of leading you to believe that they would have built a church building. And yet the problem is they never did. They never built a church building. But, I realize a lot of the church buildingites, they think I'm an idiot and a fool and whatever else. Okay, I'm really stupid, all right? So can you please show me where those 3,000 and then 5,000 a little bit later, can you please show me where they built a church building and all were in regular attendance in that church building? Because I'm stupid, so please show me. Okay, I'm waiting. Please show us where the 3,000 built a church building, because they couldn't fit in a living room. So what did they do? Okay? Now, if you're a Bible believer, if you actually care what the Bible says, then go to Acts chapter 20, verse 20. And you'll see what they were doing with those 3,000 and then 5,000, 8,000, and a whole lot more, I'm sure. What were they doing with those? "And how I kept back nothing that was profitable unto you, but have showed you," ready? "And have taught you publicly and from house to house." Where were all those thousands of people that got converted? Where were they meeting in the first century? Did they build church buildings? No. Would they have had the resources to build church buildings? Yeah, certainly they could have. They were being meeting publicly and from house to house. They split into smaller groups. Okay?
Now, I believe churches have always depended on a high level of volunteerism, and actually you're seeing an increase in volunteerism. The respondents are saying that, last year they had about 34% of the actual productive work was done by volunteers, and they actually saw an increase. So again, trying to get people to engage through various projects to do work inside the church. So this was a very, very promising number that people want to feel useful. They want to feel a part of the congregation, and they want to be given something productive to do. So I think this is a very strong indicator for churches who are really trying to connect with people. Particularly, remember when we're looking at that demographic of 6th grade through the 12th grade, let's put them to work. I think this was promising for a lot of churches, that they basically saw no changes in the level of giving from last year to this year. And so while the total number of units giving has decreased year over year, meaning, you're losing membership, the membership that you do have is still giving in proportion to keep the church operating. I also think what's not recorded here is that, at least in the U.S., we know that there were a lot of federal dollars that were given to churches to keep them shored up. And so I'm not surprised that you see that they really didn't have the bottom line losses that they would have had there not been federal dollars. I think this was a promising statistic as well, that churches reported seeing a 6% increase in participation levels over last year's participation levels. So 82% of church members were affiliated with some group. People really wanted connection. I think there was so much isolation during COVID. People were just glad to see people, and not just see them, engage with them, be a part of something bigger. So I think if COVID maybe taught us nothing else, is that people matter, and relationships matter, and connections matter. And you're starting to see this in terms of people really wanting to be affiliated with a group. I think this is actually a very positive metric in terms of the impact that technology is continuing to have in terms of connection with members. Members recognize that in order to be able to find out who was sick and shut in, or activities of the church, or things that were going on, you had to have email and you had to be connected. And so I think to see 36% more members opted to receive email communications than the previous year is huge. And that tells me that technology is being used in our churches, and that we're using it to connect with people. I think one of the interesting statistics also about the survey is that churches actually weighed in on what their board size was. And you're seeing that the average median church board size was 8 members. And I think that's a pretty interesting number. And I tried to look into why was that an ideal size for board membership. And I can tell you most of the research that I actually looked at that optimum board size of 8 to 11. You'd see that range there to be able to carry out the functions of the church. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So how did inflation actually affect the church? Well, what we saw in the research is that there had been an increase in the number of giving households, but they were giving less. So people are having to tighten their belts, and we're seeing that with increases in food costs, increases in gas costs, increases in utility costs. So while you actually saw more households and people saying, I need to give something, they weren't giving as much. But that would also explain why you didn't see a decrease in giving. You had more givers. So I think that's a credit to people being engaged, understanding that they want to financially support the church, but inflation is certainly having an impact on the amounts that are being given. No benchmark survey would be worth the paper it's written on if they didn't put some metrics in there about finances. And I did find that this was a very interesting benchmark that was reported by the respondents, that in terms of their debt load was about 7/10 the times of the church's annual giving. So the consultants actually recommended that your debt load should not be greater than 2 times the church's annual giving. So for a church that has a budget of about $500,000, you really shouldn't have greater than $1 million in debt. So I thought that was an interesting benchmark that my fiscal people, as you're watching this, you could see how does your debt ratio compare to your church's annual giving. Days cash always is a real good indicator of how your operations are doing. And I thought this was interesting that the churches that reported on average had 25 weeks in cash reserve. So, that's another financial indicator. How much cash do you have on hands and how many days could you operate on your cash reserves before you would have to go into your non-liquid assets? Now, most people that deal with staffing or budgets know that one of the biggest expenses that most organizations have are your labor expenses. And so the survey data showed that the average staff was 1 FTE for every 34 people in attendance at church. So that's how they base the staffing level. You would look at your total number of membership, and then you would say, okay, we need 1 FTE. And for you, that's not a body. An FTE is 2,080 hours worked. So for every 32 members you had at church, that requires 2,080 staff hours to be able to meet their needs. And what the Unstuck report revealed was that declining churches employed 56% more FTEs than growing churches. I thought this life cycle graph was very interesting because it shows that 16% of the respondents were in the launch phase. 2% actually had momentum in terms of growth. 10% had actually a strategic growth strategy, but the consultants didn't feel that anyone really had sustained health. 56% were kind of on maintenance, 3% preservation, and 14% of the respondents were considered on life support. Okay, so what are characteristics of a church on life support? Well, it would probably be evidenced by people not being willing to change. So we're holding on to old ideology, old methods that probably haven't worked. There is no fruit, meaning you're not seeing new membership. You're not seeing new ideas to engage or transformative thinking. They're typically experiencing a financial crisis. So if you're on life support, that typically means you're probably bleeding financially. You're not able to meet some of your short-term or long-term obligations. And then, of course, the blame game takes root because now we have to figure out whose fault is it, and we need to start blaming anybody. And that doesn't help get you unstuck because now you're just on this vicious cycle of not wanting to change. So nobody wants to be in an environment like that. The money's just not coming in because people are despondent and they're just like, you know what, I'm just not connected. And everybody's pointing fingers. I think my parting words are that no church wants to be stuck. No membership wants to be stuck. I think we all want to be able to bear fruit. We all want to be able to show the world the magnificence of Jesus Christ and how he makes a change in our lives for the better. And I think one way that we can do that is continue to uplift the body of Christ and fellowship and find ways to engage people in church life. and supporting the mission, whether that be in a small group, or whether that be in a large facility. I think the opportunities through this data allow us to see we're not doing too bad. And I think a lot of organizations will come out of this looking at this and say that. So wherever you are on the continuum, God bless you. And I hope you found this information impactful. I know I did. And this data would not have been available to us without the support of the Unstuck Church group and its leader, Tony Morgan. Thank you so much for allowing Tap Talks to share your data with our audience.